everybody. Hello, Dr. Megan Rose.
Hello, Dr. Annalisa Dare.
Yes, yes, welcome back. The last time you were here, I think you had just finished your doctorate and I was still in the trenches.
I think I had just defended. I don't think I had even gotten the, sign on the dotted line diploma version of it yet. So,
Okay, well, we're both fully doctors at this point in time. Yes. So everybody, welcome back to Journey to the Goddess TV. My name is Annalisa and I'm here interviewing Dr. Megan Rose. I'm going to give you a brief update, everybody, an updated bio, let's just say that. Who is Dr. Megan Rose? Well, she has a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and a master's degree in religion and society from the Graduate Theological Union. She is an initiated ceremonial magician, a Shakta tantric practitioner, and a senior seer in the House of Brig Fairy Seership Institute. She serves as an eco-spiritual minister and psycho-spiritual counselor and is the executive director of the Entheosis Institute. Whew, that's pretty great. So before we begin, I want to encourage everybody to like this video, to leave some comments, to subscribe to this channel and share this video for sure. And I'd also like to encourage everybody to go out and purchase Dr. Megan's book, Spirit Marriage, on Amazon. And I think many other book retailers are also probably selling it as well. And I'll leave all the appropriate links and we'll probably talk, well, the whole conversation is going to be about the book. So just wait to learn more. But before we get into it, Dr. Megan is going to lead us in an invocation.
All right. So this comes from my fairy seership training. Holy flame, holy fire, grant to us our heart's desire. Holy fire, holy flame, bring magic in the old one's name.
I love that. Thank you. Okay. So as we now segue in to the Q&A portion, we'll just start with the basic. What is spirit marriage?
Yeah. Spirit marriage is, and the subtitle of the book is Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings, right? So that is really what we're talking about. We're talking about when a human steps into a bonded, oftentimes co-creative relationship with some kind of otherworldly spirit, deity, angel, etc., 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 being, sometimes ancestors and beloved dead. So I don't like to say non-human or non-physical because that sometimes these entities are nature spirits and associated with particular things in nature, and sometimes they're deities from pantheons. And the most obvious example that most people in the Western world at least understand is the brides of Christ, right? The nuns who put on a wedding band and take vows and are married to Jesus. So I explored that topic quite in depth. It was my dissertation research and then it became this book.
Beautiful. And so I think too, when we talk about spirit marriage, one of the questions I had in the beginning when I was reading the introduction is with this concept of marriage, it seems that doesn't always reflect a sexual nature. What's the difference between a spiritual marriage and maybe allyship or the other kind of pantheon of deities a person may be working with?
Right. Well, I think we have to really unpack our understanding of marriage, right? Our contemporary understanding of marriage is really different than what folks experienced of marriage 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? It wasn't always about sex. It wasn't always about romance and attraction. Sometimes it was about uniting two different, warring groups of people. Sometimes it was about protection and safety. Sometimes it was about, money, right? So,
Yeah.
and that is, that's really true for these types of marriages as well. They're not always necessarily about romance and eroticism, although that can absolutely be a part of a spirit marriage. But they're more about um, the kind of co-creative shared consciousness, right, that can be fostered through that type of a deep devotional, bonded, committed relationship between a human and what sometimes are called tutelary spirits or familiar spirits, that just takes it a level deeper than just say a spirit that is, that is your guide or your protector being.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah, it really got me thinking differently about my relationship with Mary Magdalene. And I actually want to come back to that later once we've dived into your story a bit more. So put a pin in that, everybody. Um, Now, this is the fun part that really got like the juices in my brain going, because when I approached the topic of spirit marriage, I was really thinking in contemporary terms. And then when you laid it out and you talked about, basically you described spirit marriage in an ancient and contemporary context, I was like, oh my God, I had this whole new way of understanding sacred marriage in Mesopotamia. Again, not to go into the historicity of whether or not that actually happened, but it really recontextualized things for me, and I got really excited. So can you actually go into the evidence for spirit marriage in the past, historically, anthropologically, religiously, and in folklore?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a big
Right.
chunk, but I'll give you some of my favorite examples. So you mentioned the Sumerian sacred marriage, ancient Mesopotamia, and scholars debate sacred
Right.
marriage. Was it a royal sexual ritual? Was it, what was it? What was it? And so I just sort of like to throw my hat in the ring and say it's a spirit marriage that's going on, right? We know that in this case, the devotees of Ishtar, her priests and priestesses and priestesses, were married to her and had this very deep bonded relationship with the goddess, and were there to uphold and sometimes offer oracular, be the voice piece for her and uphold her rituals. And this was a kind of sacred marriage. We know it when we look at the stories of, like, for example, the Irish kings that would marry the goddess of sovereignty of the land, and that would confer upon them certain powers. And this was sometimes done through a proxy of, like, the high priestess, which would proxy this goddess that that the king would then be beholden and devoted to. We see it folklorically all over the place. You from stories of the fairy marriage, which is giving rise to, like, the fairy human offspring. In folklore, and then in India, the yogini tradition, where the sovereign of a particular land or the sort of chieftain would marry the yogini, which are these, like, powerful, gosh, what are yoginis? There's so many different ways of interpreting yogini, but in this case, they were more of like the guardian spirits, like the genus loci, the devis or devas of the land, or that particular indigenous tribe on the land there, and they would marry the yogini, and that would confer power and notoriety. Um, I think one of my favorite examples that I think people don't often think of as a spirit marriage, but I think really qualifies. Well, there's two. There's a sort of real life example, which is the King Numa of Pompulus, who was the first Sabine king of Rome,
Okay.
who married Egeria, who was a nymph. And it said, and this is, historically accurate in that he lived and ruled Rome and attributed all of the laws that he came up with as being inspired by his nymph wife, Egeria, to the story of Eros and Psyche, right? Or Cupid and Psyche. Psyche is this human woman who is visited by this sort of otherworldly being. She doesn't really know who he is. It turns out it's the son of Aphrodite, Cupid or Eros, and she's married to him, right? And there's all these taboos about what she can and can't do, which follow a lot of the tropes of the spirit marriage examples that I sort of curated and looked into. So lots of both mythological, historical, and like actual anecdotal evidence to this practice transculturally from the beginning, of recorded history. That's those Mesopotamian accounts are kind of like the first written records that we can find of this.
Right. Right. And yeah, specifically to the point of Mesopotamia, I had written down somewhere in my notes, and I don't remember if it was something that you had said or something I had thought in response. Doesn't really matter. But I was like, is it possible that that this spirit marriage, in the way that you are describing it, was the indigenous practice to that land prior to the patriarchalization of that culture, and the way that Inanna was used, in my view, as a proxy to confer divine kingship, or to legitimize divine kingship on the kings of Mesopotamia.
Yeah, I think that's a really salient insight. I had the same thought around the pre-Vedic traditions. So you see these sort of indigenous tribal traditions in India in general. And the yoginis were often sort of these tribal deities. And then the marriage of one is sort of what then gave, statehood and rulership, right? In some of the texts that talks about it that way. So I think there's definitely something to that.
Yes. And the other example that you bring up, I think just briefly, I didn't see you describe it in depth, but maybe you did and I missed it, is contextualizing the, I guess you want to call it the relationship, this intimate encounter in a way between God, Yahweh, and the Virgin Mary. Like that could be considered a form of spirit. And I was like, mind blown, but of course it makes so much sense. Of course.
Yeah, right. And depending on the story that you're looking at, it was either Yahweh, it was either the God of the Hebrew people at that time, or it might have been the angel Gabriel. Remember, because the angel was the part of the Annunciation.
Right. That's right.
And then there's also I think there's some versions of it where it was like this dove that descended, but it is this very, and you see it, the Greeks mythologies are rife with, human God coupling that give way to the demigods, right? Which Yeshua, the, Jesus of Nazareth, would have been a demigod by that, logic.
Right. Now, I think I had asked you at some point way in the past if Mary Magdalene and Jesus, if their relationship figured somehow in your doctoral work within the context of spirit marriage.
I didn't really look at theirs as a spirit marriage because that they were, allegedly both human physical beings, with his demigod status or whatever. But, we've talked in other, in the interview we did before about the sort of apotheosis process that the two of them went through. And I love it. I quote in the book, and I'm not going to remember the scholar right now, who talks about, again, the Indic traditions and how in one of the stories that I cite is the goddess Meenakshi, who is, again, a human woman that is beloved of the god, I believe it was Suvarna, and through their coupling, she's deified herself. And that's true for the story of Psyche, right? Psyche is elevated to the level of goddess by the end of that story, where she is now, you know, sort of on par with the spirit lover, the divine spouse. And so there's this mystery in there around the transformation or the apotheosis of the human into something other than, or more than, or you know, and I talk about this in the book around the expansion of human consciousness through this sort of spiritual technology.
Right. So that brings me to another point. Oh, perfect. Actually, the next question. In the introduction, you described spirit marriage as a liberation spirituality. And I'm going to quote something here that you said. It offers a means to personal agency, individuation of the self, and avenue for personal awakening. And then you also actually speak to it as a whole kind of like echo liberation as well. So can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Right. Well, you know, there's a lot of different terms for it, you know, what Jung called individuation, right? And this idea that, you know, Aristotle called it the entelechy, that we have this blueprint of our rarefied self. I like to call it the divine self, that we are here as an expression of. And you know, if we subscribe to the idea of the you know, the many selves, or the many aspects, right, personality aspects that are, or archetypes, inner archetypes that we have going on in any given moment, one of our inner aspects, one of our archetypes is our divine archetype, the blueprint of the flavor of divinity that we came in to express. And I love, you know, again, I'm going to go back to the Indic and the Tantric practices, where the divinities that we think of in that cosmology, like Kali, isn't just like a fixed Kali. There is, you know, 100, maybe 1,000 different ways that Kali expresses: Dakshin Kali, Adya Kali, Smashana Kali. So this idea that deity is this fixed one, you know, identity, if you're a monotheist, or a set cast of characters in certain cosmologies, I think is a little, you know, rudimentary, because the idea that we have our own unique flavor or expression of the divine that we're here to share with the world, should we decide to potentiate that in this lifetime, is, I think, a really exciting, and it's as unique as our fingerprint, right? In the ceremonial traditions, in the magic traditions, it's not a fixed pantheon of deities. It's your, what's called your holy guardian angel, right? And the knowledge and the conversation of the holy guardian angel is a quest that you go on to discover. And that name, that identity of the HGA, it could be a specific localized identity. It could be a breath. It could be an expression. It's a very fluidic kind of thing. And so how this ties into spirit marriage is one of the things that I postulate, is that spirit marriages are what help activate or potentiate or help guide us towards this knowledge and conversation with our divine self. Because sometimes the marriage is the marriage to the divine self. In fact, in the case of the Shakta Tantric that I interviewed for my book, Kali is both her spirit spouse, her spirit wife, and her divine self. And so there's a mystery there, right?
Right.
Where we can have it sort of as a both and.
Right. And yeah, I remember reading about that and just kind of fascinated how that can be both at the same time. In that case, how does one differentiate, if one even needs to? Does one even need to differentiate between the two?
I think that, you know, what I like to think of it as is we all have a divine self that we can step into relationship with. Maybe we don't all have a spirit that's ringing our doorbell wanting to marry us, but we all have a divine self that we can step into that deep devotional relationship with, and that we are nested within, right? In the in the African diaspora tradition of Vodou, they talk about the deities, the Loa, and those traditions. They can come into you, but they can also come out of you, meaning they're already nascent, sometimes asleep inside of you, that wake up and come out. And so whether it's in or out or up or down, we have this dynamic relationality, right, with the divine, that we can learn more about through our embodied practice and through our devotional practice. And I think that whether we're thinking of it as an I vow devotional relationship, or whether we're thinking of it as a co-creative relationship, that really comes down to what traditions are you working in? What practices are you using to get there? That, I think, is more to do with style than like a super delineated substance. Right. And there are practitioners out there that will argue that. That's fine. It's just, this is from the survey that I did and my own experiential account and training. That's really what I've come to.
Right. So now, like, when we're talking about spirit marriage, like, who is eligible for spirit marriage, or who would want to do this? And kind of adjacent to that question is, do you need to be part of a specific lineage in order to enter into that kind of bonded relationship?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. No, you don't need to be part of a lineage. Lineage can help particularly if you have a specific deity that's associated with a specific pantheon, and within that pantheon, they have practices and teachings. For this technology, I mentioned the Vodou tradition. They have a very well-respected practice for what's called the mariage loa in that tradition. But, in my practice with my clients, I have people that are married to beloved dead. In some cases, they were married to them in life, and then they crossed over and they stayed in that relationship. And others who have beloved dead that have come to them and wanted to marry them, that are, not part of any pantheon or not even necessarily deities. And so they, have had to sort of figure that out on their own. Or, what I like to offer with my practice is a sort of embracing of many different streams and many different traditions. So people who are sort of on the edges like that can find the tools and the teachings and the practices for cultivation of that. But having a tradition like, the heathen tradition practices God spousing, the tantric tradition practices the Ishtadevi and the spirit marriage. And I go through a number of them in the book. And then who is qualified? I mean, if you're in a human body, you're kind of qualified. It doesn't mean that you're going to want to. Not everybody necessarily wants to do this. And some people are perfectly fine never actually stepping into that level of commitment. And it is a deep commitment. It's not, not for the dabbler.
What do you think would happen to a person who doesn't heed the call, like in the Joseph Campbell hero's journey kind of way? They're being approached by the otherworldly being, but they're not, they keep rejecting it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, depending on who you talk to in the tradition, there is everything from, if you're being called into spirit marriage, you ignore that to your great peril. I tend to take more of a, my mentor, Orion Foxwood, says, gas, grass, or ass, nobody rides for free. And so, I tend to take our precious human life and our incarnation is sacred and holy, and giving space, even in your psychic space, to entities, we need to have really high degrees of discernment, right, about what we're saying yes to. And, in the book, I talk about how I talk about an instance of divorce, right, for a practitioner, Caroline Kenner, who was courted by a spirit and sort of, all right, fine, I'll marry you. Didn't know the spirit that well. And then the relationship was not working out. And so she took that spirit. And I should back up and say, Caroline is a very, very gifted medium and visionary practitioner. And so she's been seeing and working with the deities of a variety of different pantheons since she was a tiny child. So this is like, an average Tuesday for her, but being courted by spirits. And she held other spirit marriages prior to this, but this one particular problematic entity that she was working with, she found somebody sort of above his pay grade and was like, this relationship is not working out. I don't want to be married to this spirit anymore. And this divorce was granted. Now, that's in her case with that particular type of spirit that she was working with. In Orion Foxwood's case, who he's married to a very powerful fairy being called Bree, and that entailed a 7-year process of like merging and integration and rewiring of his nervous system to be able to work with that potent of entity. He's like, divorce is not an option for me. I've been irrevocably altered by this marriage process, and I couldn't go back even if I wanted to. So I think it really depends on the entity you're working with and the tradition that you're sitting within. And so we want to realize that we bring something to the table. This isn't just like, being, give over all of my agency and will to you.
Right.
We hold our boundary.
Right, which was an important lesson for you, I think you had mentioned in your book and your own journey, but we'll get to that in a bit. I also want to touch on, is it possible to still have a marriage or intimate partnerships with human people while being married to an otherworldly being?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say maybe over half of the people that I interviewed were in partnerships with humans. And I myself am in a, going on a 12-year relationship with someone who came in around a little bit after I had started working with my spirit beloved. My human partner came in, and we can talk more about that when we get to my story, how that came about. But yeah, it's very common. And it kind of also depends on the deity. In the case of the Shakta Tantric, who's married to Kali, Kali's kind of, Kali's fierce, and she doesn't necessarily like to share. So, she is single and has found trying to partner with someone not that easy. But she's also a guru. She's a teacher of many different people, and her life is oriented around serving her kula, serving her community, and being in constant sadhana practice and devotional practice with Kali, and it just doesn't leave much room for any other kind of relationship.
Right. And in that case too, that's like, and I know she did in the interview and in that chapter, you kind of go into greater detail about this kind of the gendered piece, like, that it doesn't have to be contrasexual, basically, like man to woman, woman to man. There can be a lot of different configurations, especially.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, I'm thrilled with the level of awareness that's being brought to the transgendered and non-binary community, because I think we've been way too binary and fixed in our sexual and gender identities, at least here in the West. But I think it takes it to a whole different level when we're talking about entities, whether they're divine beings or otherwise, because they're just not gendered in the way that we think of gender. They use gender more as a language. And again, it goes back to that like fixed pantheon of this being is this way and this being is this way. And it's so much more fluidic than that, when you really start dancing with spirit work and understanding that oftentimes spirit will take on a gender as a guise or a way of expressing. And this is really true for the fairy tradition as well. I mean, they're not even as anthropomorphic as most of the, traditional fairy teachings out there would, or the folklore or whatever. I think a lot of times leads us to believe, in my experience and in the trainings that I've received, they're much more of a fluidic type being.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense more so that, it's easier. Well, we don't need to go down this road too much, but human beings image is really important. So, that's a organizing principle for humans to understand,
Yeah.
an image. So 1 second, I dropped my questions. Can't, can't keep going without those. So, um, okay, I think we've kind of talked about the purpose of the bonded intimate relationship, but do you have more to add to that point?
Well, I would say that one of the opportunities for stepping into, and the potential outcomes for stepping into a spirit marriage or a bonded intimate relationship, is the co-creation that can arise. One of my teachers, RJ Stewart, says we do things that they can't, right? We've got a body, we can do all sorts of really cool things that they can't, but they do things that we can't. And so when we come together, it's this sort of unique collaboration that that can arise out of these types of relationships. And that can certainly happen with a guiding or a tutelary spirit. But when you step into the marriage, often what happens is there's a kind of a byproduct or a love child that arises out of it, some sort of co-creative project. In Orion's case, it was the whole House of Bree teaching system that came through. In my case, it was this research and book. In other cases, it might be music or art or ecological projects.
Right. So it's not just for the individual or the individual being, it's for also the community, the collective,
Yeah,
life itself.
it often is something that contributes to more than just the enhancement or the individuation of self, right? This becomes a kind of outpouring that is a blessing or a gift to the community. In the case of Thomas the Rhymer, or Thomas of Ercildoune, who was, I think, 12th century Scottish laird, his marriage to the fairy queen, he was given the gift of prophecy. And this is, someone who was already a well-respected scholar. And through this union with the fairy queen that happened, he gave prophecy and poetry, and just this tremendous mantle was given to him that was a benefit for his community.
Beautiful. Yeah, a lot of potential there, it sounds like, which is more than welcome and needed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we talked about who could undertake a spirit marriage. Here's an important question, which is regarding protocols, boundaries, like how to take precautions on the journey of spirit marriage.
Right. Well, that goes back to what I was talking about with discernment, right? So I talk about the 3Ds of spirit marriage: devotion, discernment, and discipline. And devotion is really finding that being, right? Whether it's the divine self or a deity or an earth, natural spirit, or something else, right? Angel, etc. And stepping into a devotional relationship with it, or them, or he, she, it, they, the way you would with a human, right? So you wouldn't get to know a potential partner very well if you didn't talk to them on the regular, right?
That's right.
So you have to spend time getting to know them. And that is a certain amount of devotion, right? Devotion is something that we are giving our attention and our energy and our life force, our vitality to. So devoting that time and space to really getting to know them. But really following closely on devotion is really learning how to discern that it's actually this particular deity, spirit, whatever, that you're talking to. And that requires a certain amount of magical skill building, psycho-spiritual skill building. I like to talk about, like, we have so many different inputs, right? We talked about the inner aspects. So we've got all these inner aspects going on. And then we've got all these inputs around us from media and society and family. And so the discernment piece is really like how do I discern myself, my true self or divine self? And then how do I discern the voice of the beloved from all these different things? And that takes work, that takes effort. And that leads into the third, which is discipline. That's like rolling up your sleeves and doing the magical work, the divinatory work, this psycho-spiritual work to really discern.
Right. Before we jump into your journey, I have one more question with regard to that. And if somebody is being approached by an entity in some shape or form, otherworldly entity, and it's kind of unfamiliar terrain in terms of maybe they don't consider themselves a spiritual person or what have you, a million different scenarios here. What would you suggest they do in terms of maybe reaching out to somebody or doing proper research, et cetera?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things, and this kind of leads into my story, because when I was being approached by this spirit that was a very erotic spirit, and so I was like, okay, what's going on here? I did a few things. One was, it was sort of the thing that precipitated my initiating into ceremonial magic, because I knew that ceremonial magic was going to give me the tools to create a really strong, tight container that I could control. Meaning I could control what comes in and what goes out of my space. Because the first thing they teach you in ceremonial magic is how to banish things that you don't want to have a relationship with, or that you just are encroaching and you want them out of that space so that you can open the door and close the door at will. So there's that. So there's the magical practice, but really for me, it was the mentorship. So I found mentors both in psychotherapeutic terms. I found a transpersonal psychologist that I worked with. So this was somebody who wasn't just going to psychologize or dismiss, as some sort of neurosis or pathologize what I was going through. So somebody who would embrace this idea of the enchanted universe, which is something that I'm, a big fan of, this animist understanding of, humans are not the only, nor even necessarily the most important species on the planet. And then my spiritual mentors, right? The magical community, my mentorship with Orion, the tantric mentors, things like that. People that were already in this worldview or in a relationship or practice that could help me discern, and that would be my checks and balances, really. That was key.
Great. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think that's a lot of points that people can refer to if they're asked to embark on this journey. So let's dive into your journey. And I think what might be interesting for the audience is to kind of describe how this journey began, how this, like, a little bit about your background before the spirit showed up, and then how it developed when the spirit showed up. And then I'd also like you to touch on some points. Well, we'll get to those in a minute. Let's just start.
I was going to say, you're going to have to remind me of those.
I know. I was like, stop, Anna, stop.
Where I came from and how I got there. And then where we'll talk about where we're going. So I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition. So Pentecostals are speaking in tongues, laying on of hands, channeling the Holy Spirit. That was sort of the water that I swam in growing up. And I was a very spiritually attuned child, baptized in the Holy Spirit at a really early age, and just, really walking around with my pants on fire, lit up with this, what later I would understand to be the Shekinah or the Shakti, this vital goddess essence. But, when I was a kid growing up in the church, it was the Holy Spirit, whatever that was, and later, when I went to seminary, I would unpack that and realize that, really the Holy Spirit is like the feminine face of God, the goddess. And so, just ablaze with that growing up as a kid. And as a result, really highly sensitive and attuned to all sorts of all sorts of phenomena. And so I really early on found that the ecstatic states I was experiencing in church with the Holy Spirit, I could also just as easily experience out in nature. So that was really interesting because it had nothing to do with religion. Had more to do with this embodied spirituality. So fast forward to, I decided to go to seminary and graduate school and sort of try and put my researcher hat on and understand the phenomenology of ecstatic, embodied spirituality in seminary, and came across in this great class I took on heresy, which my favorite thing to like add in this aside here is that, the word heretic literally means one who's able to choose. So heretics are folks who are choosing their belief system, which I think is really empowering. And in this class on heresy, they talked about sex with angels. They talked about this little line in Genesis where the sons of God, the angels, saw the daughters of men, the women, and found them really like yummy, and came and mated with them and gave rise to the giants, to the Nephilim, to these demigods. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. And I just sort of put that on the back burner of things to think about and went on my merry way. And then about, I guess maybe about 10, 15 years later, around the time I was turning 30, I started having this experience where this being would appear to me and want to have these erotic encounters. And usually it was when I was in either a visionary state or in a sleep and having this sort of like dream encounter. And at first I thought, oh, well, this is just me, dreaming really yummy dreams. But it became really clear that it was sort of this distinct entity that was contacting me through some various things that I won't go into, but like when you look at some of the research on extraordinary dreaming, and even like the accounts of some of the Beguine mystics and the things that they're describing, the dream lover or the fairy lover is a pretty common motif in a lot of folkloric and mystico erotic research. And so it became this sort of relationship that evolved, and eventually that dream lover asked me to marry it. And I was like, what the heck? Like, I have, like, is this even a thing? And then I remembered that sons of God, daughters of men, angels and humans. And I was like, I think this might be a thing. And this was like back in 2000. So I like used like search engine to like spirit and marriage. And I found Ida Craddock, who was a late 19th century, early 20th century mystic and magician, ceremonial magician, spiritualist, who was claimed to be married to an angel that would often visit her in her dream state. And I was like, mind blown. And I became kind of obsessed with trying to find what are the different contemporary examples of this. And that led me into my research inquiry. Yeah,
right.
Book, the dissertation, all that.
I think some of the interesting points, interesting points for me and kind of reflecting on your journey are things like the need for you to reclaim the divine feminine, and also kind of the sacralization of the female body in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk to that point and how that was integral to?
Yeah. Well, growing up in the church, in the Pentecostals are such a weird hybrid. They're like so about ecstatic embodied spirituality, but they're so patriarchal, right? And so as I was going through this awakening, this sort of erotic revivification and connection to my body through these spiritual practices and this spirit lover, I was also sort of being pulled into the direction of the Shakta tantric practices, because that they were an intact teaching system that would teach me about what it's like to see my woman's body, because I'm a female gendered person. What would it be like to see that as sacred and holy, and as the primary medium for understanding and experiencing, my spirituality? And so embodied spirituality, sacred sexuality, all those became really key to my inquiry. And if you look at, and I'm sure you know this from your research, but around the time of like Augustine, maybe even earlier than that, there was this whole actually even earlier than that, the Pauline teachings in the Gospels really did this separation between body and spirit, right? Mm-hmm. And everything associated with body was like dark and underworld and women, right? Mm-hmm. And so they kind of relegated they created this split between mind and body, or spirit and body, and between men and women, and light and dark, and the binaries go on and on and on. And so for me, it was this deep dive into body erotic, and also spirit and body eroticism, right? Women as the seductress and the temptress and all that stuff,
right?
And the witch. And so it became this deep dive into embodied erotic spirituality, and understanding, again, that divine that comes out of us, right, from this deep, deep place.
But do you think that was an essential part of your particular journey, and journey with, to even maybe recognize or be prepared for, or to be in this particular relationship with this particular being?
Yeah, I really do, because the being that, first of all, it was moving in an erotic way, with this vitalizing energy. And also, come to find out, he is a deity of the underworld. And mm-hmm. So to really, especially growing up, so upper world focused with Christianity, I had to do a whole re-education and rewiring around the underworld, and what is the underworld, and what does it mean to be wooed by and in an intimate and beloved relationship with the underworld. And that includes the dark god and goddesses, and the dismantling forces, and the fierce forces, and all of the sexual forces, all the chthonic stuff that for the past couple thousand years we've suppressed into our unconscious.
The right? Darkness of the womb itself is a chthonic space.
Yeah. Right. So it was really instrumental, and I don't know that I could have gotten there in the spirit and marriage dynamic had I not already been really in deep inquiry and practice with women's sacred spirituality and sacred sexuality. But right. They really went hand in hand. I mean, it wasn't like, this opened the door for this. It was kind of like I talk about in the book, I don't know which came first, right? They kind of arose simultaneously, and it was this sort of co-experiencing or co-inquiry of that.
Right. And you speak somewhere in there, it may have been in a conversation with your friend Bloody Mary, that something about the divine masculine, and in this relationship with your otherworldly being, it was a healing journey to heal your relationship with men as well, men and the divine masculine.
Yeah, well, I mean, growing up, and then sort of going to seminary and throwing the baby out with, I sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater with Christianity, or Pentecostalism, I should say, because it was like, well, this tradition is just way too legalistic and patriarchal and, limiting. So I'm just going to ignore all of that and study something else or practice something else over here. And I was in like a yoga class one day, and I'd been practicing for a number of years, and I was laying in corpse pose in shavasana, and all of a sudden I felt this energy rise up through my body. And it felt just like being filled with the Holy Spirit, but I was doing yoga. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. And so that actually is what led me back into sort of reclaiming the aspects of Pentecostalism that are about, being filled with, right, and almost like a kind of channeling sort of, or possessory sort of energy with this supernuminous kind of energy, but not within the confines of like religiosity.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's right.
So it's interesting because I had a connection point too. What filled me in my religious upbringing, and I was non-denominational Christian, was the singing to Jesus. And so when I found bhakti yoga and that devotional singing, it was the same feeling and coursing through my body.
Yeah.
So I get that. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So I think, so basically the last 2 points, and I kind of spoke to one of them, was that this is a healing journey, and that embodiment is also really key. At least for you, the embodiment and body awareness seem to course through your storytelling of your own journey. And I'm wondering if those 2 pieces in particular, body awareness, embodiment of either of sacred feminine energy or how you experience deity or otherworldly being, and the healing, that all the potentialities for healing, if those 2 pieces are key across the board for spirit marriage.
That's a good question. I mean, I would have to say, I don't know if they're key across the board for spirit marriage, because I'm still continuing to find examples of spirit marriage in different cultures. And so, I hate to essentialize and say, oh yes, this is true for everybody. But what I can say is, for many, many of the people that I've spoken with, the ability to be in a fully embodied state, and to have that sort of, sometimes the spirit marriage is also called an indwelling or a merge, right? So it's not about vacating and letting something else step in. It's about opening out to having even more and being filled and arising from within, without, and integrating, right, in a way that I think embodied spirituality, it's not an up and out thing, right? It's a down and in. One of my tantra teachers says it's a down and in practice. And I think that down and in and then out into the world and circulating it is a really like down, in, out, and around. It's that toroidal sphere, right? I think that's really exciting, an exciting byproduct or outcome potentially of spirit marriage type practices.
That's interesting. I was thinking about flamenco for a moment, because when we took we took a class in basically it was Sufism. And so I saw there's this great movie called Van Gogh, ! It might be Van Gogh, and it's a flamenco drama, but the opening scene is a performance that merges Sufi dancing and singing with flamenco guitar. And so I just kind of had this feeling of like for me, it feels like the energy of Sufi is that kind of down and in and out to the community. But flamenco, for me, as someone who dances, it feels like it's actually originates with the mother and comes up through the body, through the heart, and then out to the community. And that feedback loop goes in that direction.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just,
yeah, but I danced flamenco for a little while as well. But like a lot of the florios, they're up and out, but then are also down and in. So you're moving, right? With it.
Yeah.
You're directing the energy in this, what Orion calls the witch's mill.
Mm.
Right. So it's this moving of the energy up, out, and around, down and in, out. And I think that, in the tantric context, it's down and in the some of the more other Indic traditions, it's up and out, and certainly a lot of the Christian traditions, it's up and out. And I think we want both, right? And that is the downward pointing triangle and the upward pointing triangle coming into union together, right?
Totally.
And creating that seed, creating that potentiation, which you see in so many of the yantras in the middle of these cosmograms. This, those two things come together, sort of open up the field of possibility. And so, I think of it a lot as the downward pointing triangle is the human aspect of things, so incarnate, and then the upward pointing triangle is the otherworldly aspect. And then we bring those two together in co-creation, and all sorts of exciting things happen.
I love that. That's very holistic. It's just, rounding the circle there. And it gave me a new way to think about dancing flamenco. So thank you. Again, I mentioned earlier that I was able to reflect on my own relationship with Mary Magdalene while reading your book, and you specifically your account and Kama's account of, being married to Kali. And I guess, I had an experience of her coming to me in meditation and being very clear that she would be my guide and my guru. And it kind of morphed into friend at some point. And I had said for a long time that I believed that it was her Shakti that brought me to Pacifica to study more deeply about her and sacred female embodiment, because I didn't have any other frame or language, and I would still call it that. But spirit marriage or some kind of bond happened for me. And what's interesting is I felt kind of guilty because the last 3 years or so, I really lost my connection with her. And you described, Nick, that experience for yourself, your own deity, and as Kama did as well. And then I felt like relief that, that happens and I can re-engage. And I can explore the reasons why the connection was lost. And I think it was so I could connect more deeply with Inanna, who is central to my thesis. And even before this interview, I reconnected with Mary Magdalene in a kind of visionary state as a way to, kind of rekindle that connection. And she was there the whole time. Like you said earlier, like the potentiality is always kind of latent in the body.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think that is, sometimes we draw near to a particular spirit or deity, and we become sort of saturated or permeated with that devotional practice. In fact, in some of the Indic traditions, they say how the lakshana or our features actually shift and change to look more like the deity that we're in, like a devotional sadhana spiritual practice with. And then that deity may recede, like it's almost like we've been suffused in that, and then they may recede and something else, like a new flavor, a new seasoning comes in, or we move into a different phase of life, right, where we need to embody a different energy. So it's one of the things that I really love about the different entheosis, right? This is the entheosis conversation, the divine within. We don't necessarily just have one deity. There's this fixed deity for